Hey everyone, welcome to the Renovation Theory podcast. On this podcast and through our Facebook group, we are working on building a community that's going to break down walls through authentic conversation. Thanks for joining us. We're your hosts. I'm Pat, and this is Britt.
Hey everybody. Today we're going to talk about some recent things that have happened in the sports world and how they relate to emotions in the workplace.
So our jumping off point for this episode is the Serena Williams US Open controversy. There's a lot of drama and a lot of stuff swirling around about that, but we're going to focus on how the emotions of particularly women are portrayed in professional environments, you know, based on the reactions to the Serena Williams and championship match at the US Open.
Right.
So
so we've seen there's been a lot of other articles that have kind of taken their stance on this particular topic. And, we weren't really originally thinking that we were going to talk about it at all. But I saw this really interesting article and we just kind of decided that it was something we wanted to dig into. But in case you don't know what's been going on.
Yeah. So a couple weekends ago at the US Open in New York, it came down to the final women's singles tennis match, and it was Serena Williams against Naomi Osaka. I can remember her last name, not her first name. But and Naomi's a young girl who's idolized Serena and looked up to her, and so it was a big build up to this match because Serena's just come back from having a baby and is working her way back to tennis shape, and potentially the greatest female athlete of all time, if not one of the greatest athletes of all time, period. So there was just a lot of build up to this match. And
a lot more people watching, I think, maybe than normal too.
Sure. So
just with that, because she was about to defend, or I think if she would have won, she would have tied
the all-time record for major titles in tennis. So there was a lot going on around this match. And so it was probably under a little bit more scrutiny than it would have, but it's still the final at the US Open, which is a big darn deal.
Right.
And so at this match, at some point in I believe it was the first set, Serena Williams' coach got caught giving her a hand signal from the box, which is not okay as far as the rules of tennis goes. And so the chair umpire gave her a warning for that, which is within the rules for him to do that. It's debatable whether he should have or not, but
based on, and this is a little bit important, it's really debatable based on history, I guess, is the way that I would describe it. Like it's not a super objective rule.
It's against the rules for a coach to coach their player from the box, but it's talking to other players and coaches. It's something that happens all the time and rarely ever gets called.
Right.
So that was a warning, but it was just a verbal warning. The umpire just said, Serena Williams, you got a warning. You can't do that.
Right. And she immediately reacted with kind of an emotional response saying that she doesn't cheat.
Yep.
And so that the emotions piece started to play in really quickly in this whole scenario.
Yep. And so the match went on a little bit longer, and Serena got mad after a particularly bad game that she played within the match. And after the end of the game, she smashed her racket and broke her racket on the ground, which again, within the rules is a violation. And so she got called again. But this time, because it was her second warning, her second code violation in the match, she got penalized a point.
Right.
And she was not happy already with how she was playing. And then she got penalized a point and was even more not happy.
Yeah, and emotional again. And I think, I don't remember exactly when she started just this whole time she's having a fairly heated conversation with the ref
the umpire, chair umpire.
I'm really bad at tennis words.
So in between games, they go and sit at their chairs next to the umpire. And during that whole commercial break on TV, she was letting him know how much she didn't like the fact that she was penalized a point, and she felt it really hurt the match. And she called him a thief at one point and kept saying that he needed to apologize to her because she didn't cheat, but he was a thief. And he took exception to that, which, again, debatable on whether he should have or not, but it was within the rules for him to give her another code violation for back-talking like that to him.
Verbal abuse.
Basically. Yep. It's a very subjective rule based on how much the umpire is willing to take verbally. And that's where that's where I think most of the controversy comes, and we're going to kind of talk about it. But that third violation cost her a whole game. And this was late in the match. And the sad thing about this whole deal is Naomi Osaka was playing really, really well. And without all this drama, you can't say, but very well might have beaten Serena anyway. Right. And that the very really sad thing is that this whole drama and this whole situation overshadows Naomi Osaka's first U.S. Open, first major title against Serena. And so once Serena got penalized that game, the match was basically over at that point. I think there were 2 more games that needed to be played for Osaka to finish up. No, I think she just needed to win 1 more game at that point. But she won 1 more game, and there were lots of tears from both players. Serena actually handled it really, really well and was consoling Naomi. And
although we'll get into this a little bit, that is totally debatable from the world of viewers. Like, there are several people that say she handled it not very well, and a lot of people that say she handled it really well. So
that's what happened at the U.S. Open. And there have been lots of articles and discussions about it from lots of different areas. Other former umpires and former tennis players and current tennis players have weighed in on this. So there's lots of actual, whether or not that was within the rules, tennis talk happening. But then there's people outside the tennis world talking about it. And obviously discussions of race come in whenever you're talking about Serena Williams.
Right.
Rightfully so. But then gender also comes in, because that's a lot of what Serena was mad about. Was she thought she was unfairly treated as a woman in this situation. And that's kind of where that's where we're going to focus our talk today, is around the gender, and not specifically Serena, but just how gender how emotions are perceived differently from genders.
Right. And I think what's really interesting about this particular event that happened is, I think Naomi and Serena really represent kind of 2 opposite ends of a spectrum, so to speak, of emotions and how to react to a certain situation. Naomi is very, like, you could tell even in her like acceptance speech and stuff, like, she's just very reserved, and she doesn't have the experience of a ton of years either, so she's working as a fairly young person in a really complex situation.
She's 20,
right? And her natural reaction was to shut down a little bit, and Serena's is definitely more to draw light to it and draw people in and help them to see and ask questions and challenge. And she gets really passionate. And I think there's a really interesting discussion around, is either one of those, not right or wrong isn't the right wording, but just what's the value of each of those, and how are they perceived, and how are they negatively perceived, and how can we learn some lessons from those that we might be able to use. Not obviously, most of us are not professional athletes, but I think the reason why we started kind of talking about this as a topic was I read a blog from a marketing agency actually that talked about Serena and what this particular thing meant for women in the workplace. And it really just did change my thinking on it a little bit, because I think a lot of times we don't think of professional athletes as that being their workplace, but it absolutely is.
Sure is, yeah.
And I think that there are some interesting things that we can kind of discuss in that realm. So, I guess the thing that when we had a lot of discussion about this personally, and I've had discussions on Facebook about it. Right. We read like Pat was mentioning, a lot of different articles, and I think one of the things that you haven't really touched on much yet, but the reason why there's a lot of subjectivity, objectivity conversation going on is because there are tons of examples in men's tennis of much worse displays of specifically the verbal abuse piece of swearing and yelling and throwing things at the ump and all that. So it's like,
Serena felt there was a double standard happening. Like she was penalized merely because she was a female, and this umpire didn't want to hear this talk from a female, but had taken talk like this from males.
Right. So in this blog that I was just referencing that we'll link to in the show notes, there's a really interesting tweet from somebody where they have both in New York Post tweets, but they're headlines for actual articles. And the headlines are: Serena has the mother of all meltdowns in U.S. Open final loss, and it's a picture of her yelling at the umpire. And then the second tweet that it shows is a baseball player with his face like right up in an which is more common definitely in baseball.
It's a manager, the manager for the Yankees.
Okay. And it says Yankees rally for a win after Boone gets ejected for arguing a strike. So just the interesting language there of it's Serena, and so now it's the mother of all meltdowns. And, I'm sure there was some thought of, she's just coming back from being pregnant, so it's clever that we're calling it the mother of all meltdowns. But
even calling it a meltdown versus Boone arguing a strike.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about the same thing. It's two different sports, but they're both arguing over a call that the umpire
made.
And how is that written about differently?
Right. And I think, not that we want to get super deep into the race conversation, because I think that adds a whole different layer, but whether or not you can take that out of the conversation completely is I think, a valid question to ask in just the perception, the baggage you attach to the emotion, I guess, is maybe the best way that I would describe to it. And that comes with a lot of like cultural stereotypes and things like that. And
you were even mentioning just the fact that Naomi Osaka is part Japanese, and that's a culture that you kind of grew up a little bit in.
My family is Japanese American, so which is the same as hers actually. So just understanding what that means, like the way that arguments and discussions happen is much more internalized, sometimes detrimentally so, but if nothing else, behind closed doors.
Sure.
And that reaction I would say it would have to be something super grave for me to expect to see that from somebody with a cultural upbringing like Naomi Osaka has, just based on my personal experience. And, again, I'm making generalizations, but I think, I saw a lot of my family dynamic in the way her and her family were reacting to that moment as it was happening. Specifically, her mom was there, it's the Japanese side is on her mom's side.
Yep.
Just I think there's a lot to be said about when you have the cultural background that Serena has had and having to kind of fight to have your voice heard, that you learn to speak a lot louder and more emotionally to feel like you're being heard. So I just don't think you can take that piece out of the discussion.
And that's just Serena's personality, and always has been.
Totally.
Since like that was something that both her and Venus have done since the beginning of their careers, and I'm pretty sure their dad taught them, their family taught them that, but just to be vocal and to not back down and to say what you're thinking and say what you believe and mean it.
Right.
And so that is a very different personality than Naomi Osaka. And the thing that really got me in the acceptance speeches, which they do literally right after the match. So they take like a couple commercial breaks to reset the court, but then they do the acceptance speeches and stuff. And first of all, the crowd was booing because they were on Serena's side, and Serena did a good job of calming them down and saying, don't boo. This is not what this moment is about.
Right.
We need to celebrate this. The thing that really got me, and I just, kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, just to almost cause me to melt down at this, was the fact that Naomi felt like she had to apologize for how that went down.
I know.
And that kind of goes back to how her culture, her family culturally may have dealt with issues like that. But you just won a major title, and all you can think to do is apologize to the crowd.
And to your point, she literally did nothing wrong. I mean, she played so well. She played cleanly. She kept her cool as well as anybody can in that situation. I think she, somebody had mentioned in an article that she might not have even fully understood what was happening until it was well into it, until she started winning a point and then a game.
Yep.
And so, kind of feeling a little bit disoriented by that. And, that's not how you want to win against somebody that you really respect. Like, for her to say, to have that be how Serena remembers her winning against her, like, that's not what she wants.
Right. How does that, speaking about emotion and just the different ways that people, let alone genders and their emotions are portrayed. Talk a little bit more about that article about emotions in the workplace and how, what that was saying.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's really interesting and this is something that I talked to a lot of different people about. And so I think it's part of the reason why it's something I wanted to bring to this discussion. But there are a lot of people, I think, who almost get penalized, maybe not officially, but sort of seen differently because they bring an emotional aspect to their work, whether that be, I think there's sort of the more like universally negative sides, like getting really mad and upset and whatever. And then there's even just like to the point of stress, right? That we get so emotional that we maybe cry because we're stressed out or whatever. And I can definitely say, and this is something that they said in this blog that we'll link to, is, there have been times where I have cried at work. And I think that we don't like to admit that because especially in the American workplace, we have this weird relationship where it's like our job is so much our identity, but then we're not allowed to bring emotion to it. Where I think in other cultures, it's maybe not quite so much of your identity. So maybe you don't have that emotional connection to it. Or maybe the emotions, I don't know, I guess I can't think of any examples where emotions are more
I don't think we can't bring emotion to it. It's just that we can't bring certain emotions to it.
Which is almost worse.
We're supposed to celebrate.
Right.
We're supposed to be frustrated to the point of making ourselves better at our job. Sure. We're supposed to be certain emotions, but you're right. When it comes to sadness or stress or something negative, then that's not something we're supposed to bring.
Right. Any point where it becomes like crippling to your ability to do the job is where I feel like you reach that point where people around you may see that as a negative, or your bosses might see that as a negative. And, what would happen if we were to flip that and say like, oh, obviously that person cares so much because they're emotional, or what's the root cause that's making them so emotional? Is that something that needs to be addressed? Like, are we contributing to the need for emotion, like negative emotions?
But who's to say it's detrimental to your job?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Like, I mean, sure, you don't want everybody coming out of every meeting that they have crying, but I've been in meetings at work where people have cried.
Right.
And yeah, it's very uncomfortable.
Sure.
It's uncomfortable when somebody cries, but on some levels that was a really good meeting because we figured out a solution to a problem that was stressing all of us out in the room.
Right. And a lot of times,
just that some people's reaction to that stress in that meeting is to cry in that moment.
Yeah, and they shouldn't be penalized for that.
Right.
And like for me, in the cases that I can think of where I've gotten to the point of that need to like physically express emotion, it's because I am so overwhelmed by either what I committed to do or somebody else committed me to do, and my choices are to like internalize that and try to like press it down and make stuff happen, or to communicate it. And then a lot of times I leave with a better solution, with the team understanding how I feel and then being able to go forward and like focus on what has to get done instead of how I feel about what has to get done.
Yep.
And so, what I think, what are we missing out on, or what are we losing by not letting people just let that stuff out, or having a safe place for them to let that out without, and giving it a chance to not affect the job as much as it could if it just festers, you know?
So I was listening to a podcast this past week, and we'll link it in the show notes. I don't remember exactly what who the person on the podcast was, but they were talking about how they do conflict resolution basically at this guy's office. He's a CEO.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about how they do conflict resolution. And again, I don't remember all four. They went through 4 things for every conflict resolution or any meeting that came to, kind of a disagreement.
Right.
Where they needed to come up with a solution. And the first 2, they all started with F's. So the first one was facts.
Mm-hmm.
So come to me with the facts of the situation.
Right.
But the second one was feelings. How does this make you feel?
Mm-hmm.
Like that, he says, in order for you to come up with a solution that everybody can get behind, you have to at least acknowledge that these facts make people feel differently.
Right.
And so, yeah, the facts are what you need to start with and set your ground on. But feelings play a role, and we can't hide from that.
Right. Well, and I know I've definitely been in meetings where I feel like I'm getting kind of called out because of my emotions or like my gut reaction to something, or that it kind of it's a little bit discouraging, and like I've sometimes feel like I've had to learn to like put up some sort of mask, and I don't necessarily know that that's helping anything. Or helping me be the best version of me in my job all the time. So
what part of that, or do you think that you being a female in the workplace has any impact on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I guess I feel like it's because I'm a more emotional, or one of the more emotional people in my workplace. And, there's definitely a stereotype around women being more emotional, and there's whatever, I think
that's a much bigger cultural
yes.
issue, but you're right, that is the stereotype.
Yeah, I guess I would say that I believe people are all equally emotional. It's just I think women have been culturally trained to actually show our emotions,
and men have been culturally trained not to show
right.
our emotions.
So indirectly, yes, I guess.
Okay.
But it's just interesting because I think that as much as I can think of examples of feeling like I was negatively, like things went negatively because of emotions, or, broke down in a meeting or whatever, I can think of so many positive examples where maybe not necessarily emotions, but emotional perceptiveness have helped me connect with people in a greater way. Or
you being perceptive of other people's emotions, or other people being more perceptive of yours?
Either.
Okay.
Both. But have, being able to kind of pick up on things and understand, or ask the questions around like what's making you emotional, or, what are the feelings behind that, or why are you feeling that way, has allowed me to have greater relationships with my colleagues and bosses and, other people that I come in contact with in a work relationship. So I think that there's this idea of like emotions equating weakness, but I can think of so many examples where like either having the emotions and portraying the emotions on being on that side, or being the person to receive the emotions from somebody else has made me so much closer. So it's just an interesting...
It is an interesting thing, because going back to sports,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of where we started this whole conversation. If you think about team sports specifically, it's so much about emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we were just watching NFL.
Right.
And when somebody scores a touchdown, they get excited. The fans get excited. The rest of their team gets excited.
Mm-hmm.
When somebody throws an interception, the team gets mad. They get mad at the receiver for not doing the right thing. That's all built on emotion. And
right.
that's men in sports, but you even see it in female sports as well, whether we're talking about soccer or WNBA or something. That's all about emotions. And so it's just a weird, it's kind of weird that in Serena's case, she almost got penalized for the emotion. And
she did get penalized.
You're right, she did. And that's more of a statement on the sport of tennis and how that kind of started and everything. But going back to the workplace and how we don't think of sports as a workplace, but if we start thinking about those sports as a workplace and realizing that those emotions bring those teams closer together. That's one of the things you always hear championship teams say about each other is we were a family and, you know, they're my brother or they're my sister. And we just got along so well and we meshed because of the emotions. And sometimes an outrage is a little outburst is what you need to make that emotional glue stick.
Right.
But when we get to our corporate jobs, it's like, nope.
Can't be emotional.
Can't be emotional. This is real work we're doing.
Right. And I do think that that's an interesting piece about the sports too, because I do think that is one of the most culturally appropriate ways for men to express emotions. Not even just sports players, but male fans too.
Yeah.
And actually intimacy, oddly enough, if you think about the whole idea of guys smacking each other on the butt. And I was really, as a photographer in college and was often on the sideline at football games. And granted, we went to a small Christian college, so it's a little bit different atmosphere. But at the same time, listening to the love and admiration and the expression of that these guys had for each other, because it was in the safety of this is a man's sport, whereas playing football. And I feel it sort of, you know what I mean? It broke down those barriers of well, I can say some things that I would not feel comfortable saying in any other context. And so I think that's that's a little off topic of what we were saying, but what does that say about our culture when the best place for men to express their emotions is in the context of sports?
Yeah, that's kind of where we're at. I mean, even goes as far to fandom as well. Some of the best ways for guys who are sports fans, football fans, basketball fans to express emotions are at the bar when they're watching the game or in their man cave when they're with their buddies watching the game. And it's a whole cultural thing that we've created and perpetuated for a really long time.
Right. Yeah. And I guess what does that do if you're not a sports fan?
Yeah.
And what does it do to kind of keep that bubble for people that are sports fans and teach them about when it's okay to be emotional? And you see guys all the time on they won and they're crying and nobody makes any big deal about it. It's you have this pouring out of out all this adrenaline and all the physical things that are going on, but also you win the Super Bowl and you have a year of buildup or however, years and years of buildup for things. And, all that obviously comes out emotionally as it should.
Right. And we post it on social media and we may giggle a little bit at it, but it's totally acceptable. Right. And we're yeah, of course, your team that you have nothing to do with except rooting for them from your couch just won the national championship. And so, Right.
Be
emotional about it. Be excited about it.
So, we take that as passion. They're passionate about that job. They're passionate about that sport, or they're the winning, or they're, passionate about all the hard work that they've put in. But then when it comes to because this is a desk job, I'm not allowed to be passionately emotional in the point that would make me cry or yell in a meeting, and granted, there's a good and bad way for me to yell in a meeting, obviously. I'm not saying that we should get to the point where we're all just passionately screaming at each other in meetings, but I think for us to allow there to be room for that and say, I'm investing so much of my life. I think about a lot of times I spend more time with my coworkers than I often get to spend with Pat, who's my husband. And, I have to really like those people, and it's almost.
You don't have to like me.
I'm just saying, for the amount of time, I think a lot of times we sort of see those relationships or the ability for us to emote with each other as sort of a throwaway thing. It's they're just my coworkers. But, when you're spending 40 hours a week for weeks on end, it's no, you need to invest in those relationships in order to have vulnerability and create safety and trust. And I think, but for some reason that all those like mushy, soft things are soft skills specifically, not leadership is celebrated. Mm-hmm. And the ability to like lead people and show people and have foresight and that kind of soft skill is celebrated. But then when we have, when we get upset about something or you don't like the way something turns out, that's frowned upon. And so it just is like an interesting spectrum.
Yeah, it's just, it's very weird that in certain situations, and I shouldn't say it's very weird because to a certain extent, we need to be able to control our emotions differently in different circumstances that we're in. But a lot of times, and the generalization obviously, but we've taken that to the extreme in certain situations. Mm-hmm. Like here's a spot where, like for me, here's a spot where I, as a man, can express emotion. Mm-hmm. It would be acceptable for me to cry or get super excited or yell out of passion. Mm-hmm. Here is a situation where I'm not. Mm-hmm. And, sports being one of them, work is probably not the best place for me to do that. Unless, and I think this is to your point, I can remember several times in my career where I have had a couple people that I was super, super close with and, spent almost more time with them than I spent with you. When I was in the room with just those people, I could express emotions in whatever way I needed to kind of unwind from a bad meeting with a boss or a coworker. And that was acceptable. But we had to have that rapport and that relationship and that vulnerability built into our working relationship before that was acceptable. Like I couldn't have walked in day one and done that.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, I was just thinking, kind of contrasting some of the different jobs I've had, and I definitely do. I think there is an aspect of like, it's a little bit more acceptable to kind of stray outside those boundaries when your team has like a common set of language, and I think you see that like using sports as an analogy again of, when you play football and the goal is to win and the way to win is this and we know the plan to win is this and we know the plays that we specifically had, and now it's like we have this common set of language, and I think there are a lot of companies that kind of operate like, we all know, I think everybody in any company knows the goal is to make more money for the company, to be successful, whatever that looks like, but does every person, in the same way as like a football team, does every person know how their job affects that goal? Or do they have a common set of language, or we call them core values, and we have core values for us as well with renovation theory, because we want to be able to create this common thread of like, what do we celebrate here? What do we frown upon? What can you be vulnerable and emotional about that we understand and can get on board with? And not that we don't want you to be vulnerable and emotional about those things, but I think it's helpful to understand that in the context of a group.
So maybe that's where, and trying to bring it full circle here, that maybe that's where the waters got so muddy with the Serena Williams US Open controversy. Mm-hmm. They have a set of rules, and the umpire thought he was operating within those rules.
Right.
Whereas you're talking about, like with an NFL team specifically, or with your job where you guys have your core values laid out, you've got everything measurable there that you can look towards. And so if there is an outburst or if there is some form of emotion, you can channel it towards one of those things. And you've got the relationships with the people around you in order to help you channel that frustration, that anger towards one of your goals or something that you're working towards as a business objective, or winning a game in the case of an NFL team. But when we get down to Serena Williams at the US Open, she was on her own. And the rule is not very specific.
Right. And she's not allowed to talk to her coach in that moment.
Yep.
So I guess it did beg the question as you were saying that, like, what would have been the right way for her to emotionally respond in that situation?
I don't think she was wrong in the way she emotionally responded.
Well, no, I know, but as far as the rules are concerned,
Okay.
like if you're saying that's penalty worthy, then how should she have responded? And especially as somebody who we've already discussed, she's a passionate, vocal, emotional person. So like assuming not everybody is this timid, calm person, more like Naomi, you know, she needs to have a way where it's acceptable for her to express that emotion without getting penalized,
right.
and to be able to vent and you know, blow off that anger that she needs to blow off so that she can focus on playing the game. And I think that's true for us in any capacity. Like, I guess just to take that time to think about in any situation that you're in regularly. So for us, most of us be work, but I think home could be another place to do that. Like, when I get to the point where my emotions are at X level, what's my plan to respond to that in a way that I will feel good about? I will feel like it was productive. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's not messy. Just like, I'm not taking it out on my kids when I don't mean to do that, or I'm not, you know, crying in front of my boss if, you know, maybe I don't have that vulnerable relationship with them and I don't feel comfortable with that. And I'd rather have that conversation with my, like, you know, peer coworker instead of with my boss, and then be able to go to my boss in a more composed way, or whatever the case may be. And I think a lot of times because emotions are something that we don't have a great language to talk about, we just tend to like bottle them up until it's too much.
So as we get to the end of this episode and this piece of this conversation,
Right.
This is definitely not the whole thing. What we want to do is have you guys chime in.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want this just to be a conversation between us two. And so we've created a Facebook group called Renovation Theory. The link will be in our show notes below, or you can go to facebook.com and just search for Renovation Theory. Join our group and then get involved in the conversation around this. Mm-hmm. We've talked about a lot of things
Mm-hmm.
about emotions
Mm-hmm.
and sports and in the workplace, and just how emotions are perceived and what we can do about them. And we will have some questions posted in the Facebook group this week about that, and
Mm-hmm.
you can join in the discussion there and the conversation there.
Yeah, and along with that, we want you to, we want this to be a really collaborative community. So if you have questions either about the format or about things that we've talked about, or if you have questions that you feel like could contribute to the ongoing conversation, we'd love for you to reach out to those. But we try to post a few times during the week on the group to really try to keep that conversation moving. So reach out to us.
So if you've made it this far, thank you. We really appreciate it. This is episode 5, and so we are just getting this thing off the ground, and we're enjoying it so far. We hope you are too. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe using your favorite podcast player, whatever you listen to, or YouTube as well. You can subscribe to the channel there and get notified every single time we come out with a new episode. Every Thursday, that's when we're going to be putting these out. So if you haven't done that, subscribe and head over to our Facebook group and join the conversation. We'll see you next week.